There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of F1 driver pairings over the years, and today we're going to go over some of the most notable mismatches between teammates. It was hard to choose criteria for this video, but we're going to go with examples that stem from typically one season that was a massive differential between the two drivers, and then we'll examine some of the history around those seasons and surrounding the drivers as well. So let's get started right away with the first example, and arguably the best example for this list, Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber. This started in 2009 when they teamed up under the Red Bull Renault name. At that time, it was their first season, and Vettel outscored Webber 84 to 69.5. Not a massive differential. And the following season in 2010 was Vettel's first World Drivers' Championship, where he finished with 256 points, just 4 points ahead of Ferrari rival Fernando Alonso, and 14 points ahead of Webber. Again, not a massive differential here, but like I said, this is all going to build up to one massive season. 2011, Vettel won the title again, and this time he won by 122 points and leaving Webber in third with 258, which was a 134-point swing at that point for Vettel. So at this point, I mean, that went from 14 to 134. Shit's getting a little bit out of hand for him. And Vettel has just won his second World Drivers' Championship in a row. That led on to 2012, which for the third season in a row, Vettel won the World Drivers' Championship and outperformed Webber with 5 wins to Webber's 2 and 6 poles compared to 2, en route to a 102-point differential in favor of Vettel. So not as big as 2011, but still enough for Vettel to win the championship very comfortably and clearly outperform Webber once again. And in their final season together, Vettel won his fourth straight championship. He outscored Webber by a massive 397 to 199 point gap with a 198 differential, which was essentially double what Webber scored that season. This was obviously this was the same year as the multi 21 incident, and could have been a big reason why that was their last season together. But I mean, how many years is Webber going to come in second to Vettel? So that was their history, 4 years in a row. And after that season, Red Bull promoted Daniel Ricciardo for the 2014 season, and he, in his first season with Red Bull, went on to outscore Vettel. And the rest is history with Daniel Ricciardo and Red Bull. But speaking of Daniel Ricciardo, another example on this list is going to be in 2021 when Ricciardo teamed up with Lando Norris at McLaren. And this year, Norris was sixth place with 160 points ahead of Ricciardo in eighth place with 115. Only a 45-point spread. But at this point, McLaren was a midfield team, and Lando was at the head of the midfield, and in 2021 even finished ahead of Leclerc in the Ferrari. So clearly the top of the midfield, and that carried over into 2022 as well, where Norris was in seventh with 122 points to Ricciardo's 11th with only 37 points, a 85-point differential, and Ricciardo was 12 points back from Bottas in 10th in the Alfa Romeo, which at that point, was not as good as the McLaren, obviously, and tied with Vettel in the Aston Martin. Norris was clear in seventh ahead of Ocon and firmly behind Hamilton. So Norris again was the top of the midfield, and Ricciardo was nowhere to be found in the McLaren. Obviously, these were two of his worst years. And after the season, McLaren moved on to Oscar Piastri, and Ricciardo went to RB, where he finished career up to this point. Now, I want to take a step back in time because all of these aren't going to be totally recent examples. I want to go back to 1986. Ayrton Senna and Johnny Dumfries. Fourth place for Senna this season with 55 points, and 13th place for Johnny with only 3 points. This is going to be the craziest percentage point gap differential on this list. And it was followed up by a 57-point to 7-point gap the following season to Satoru Nakajima and a third place to 12th place split. So these were two dominating seasons for Senna against his teammates. And then following these two seasons, in 1988, it is when Senna got his first driver's title and outscored his teammate by only 3 points. And Alan Prost obviously just missed out on the championship there. So after 2 seasons of dominating his teammate, got a better teammate in Prost, and still went on to win the championship. One note of that 1986 season, though, with Dumfries is that he DNF'd 9 out of 16 races, but although Senna DNF'd 6 out of 16, so they both had quite a few non-finishes, but obviously that wasn't going to really make up for the 55 to 3-point gap. So that's going to be the biggest percentage gap on this list. Obviously the points the points back then weren't as much as they give now. So it's not entirely representative. It's not like somebody scoring 450 points back then. But regardless, that was the most probably dominating season we're going to see on this list. But speaking of domination, let's move on to Max Verstappen because he's had a couple teammates at Red Bull so far, and he's obviously kind of made all of them look bad. Starting in 2019 with Alexander Albon, the point spread was 278 to 92, which is a 186 point differential. Scored 3 times more points than him, and that led to Max finishing in third place, to Albon down in eighth. And the following year in 2020, Max scored 214 to Albon's 105, so he lowered the gap there to 109 points. But Max finished again in third, and Albon only moved up one place to seventh. After that, Red Bull moved on to Sergio Perez and started their 3-year run, soon to be hopefully 4-year run of winning the championship. But in 2021, obviously the most controversial ending to the season, Max that season scored 395.5 to Perez's 190. Again, pretty pathetic. 205.5 point spread, and Perez finished fourth behind both Mercedes. It was Max's first World Drivers' Championship. It came down to literally the last lap of the last race. And to be fair, in this specific race in Abu Dhabi, Perez did help Max quite a bit in that race, holding up Lewis Hamilton, and then Michael Massey just kind of did his thing. But that ended with one of the most controversial race endings and ending to a season ever. And if Perez maybe played a bit of more of a role all season and wasn't like always behind the Mercedes, essentially, it probably wouldn't have ended up there. I guess you could say the same about Bottas and Hamilton if one of them did more. There's always what ifs, but it didn't have to come down to that last race. And obviously, if the car's good enough for Max to be, in first place, close with Lewis Hamilton, then he could have been closer than 205 points behind. I mean, he could have done more, obviously. That led on to the 2022 season where Max finished with 454 against Perez's 305. That is a 149 point gap, lower than the 2021 season, but still pretty pathetic. And he placed third place behind Leclerc in the driver's standings. Domination all year again from Red Bull, but Perez still finished behind the Ferrari of Leclerc, and with that big of a gap, I mean, pretty trash. I don't know. Again, it's like what ifs, like who would be better in that spot. It doesn't really matter because when that's the standard and you're still that far behind, that's still pretty terrible. It got way worse in 2023. Obviously, Red Bull that year only lost one race the entire season as a constructor, Singapore to the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz, but they were unstoppable that season, and the final point total was 575 for Max to only 285 for Perez, and that's 290 points. Now, he did finish in second place, so I guess they couldn't have done much better, but when, as a constructor, your car's winning every single race except for one, uh, you would kind of expect to be closer than 290, and this is the trend since Perez started with Red Bull, and it hasn't stopped now. In 2024, the current point spread is 331 to 144, and that's a 187 point difference. Perez is currently in 8th place to Max's first place, and it has been an absolute catastrophic season for Perez, especially since Lando Norris's first win in Miami. He's been virtually no help to Max since that first quarter of the season. But, fortunately for Max, the lead is still high enough where he should be able to hold off. Regardless of how the World Drivers' Championship finishes up, it's going to be exciting. And Perez is falling off so hard, it's guaranteed Red Bull cannot win the Constructors unless McLaren just has the biggest meltdown we've ever seen. And they'll be lucky if Ferrari isn't past them in second by the end of the season, because at least they have some kind of consistency. Sometimes it's finishing 1-2 and then double DNFing the next race, but at least they're consistent. And they've been on a better trend than Red Bull because really the only one that scored points in the last 10 rounds has been Max. So that is probably the second biggest example of mismatched teammates. I get Perez is a good teammate, but to be that far off the number one driver is pretty ridiculous. I mean, I guess we have to consider like who would be closer. I don't really know, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day because the numbers don't lie. And maybe not maybe this next example isn't a worse teammate on paper, but in all of our minds, he's a worse example. And I think we know who we're talking about here. Lance the Window Licker Stroll. Started in 2019 on Racing Point, and he was towards the bottom of the midfield and outscored by the formerly mentioned Sergio Perez, 52 to 21. In 2020, Checo outscored Stroll again, 125 to 75, a 50-point difference, and a 7-place differential in the Drivers' Championship. Perez finished all the way up in fourth, with Stroller being down in 11th. Uh, Pretty pathetic. 2021, better season for Stroll. Only 9 points behind Vettel, 43 to 34. And we're only going through all of these just so you can kind of see the history of the teammate, because it's not necessarily just one group of teammates, but it seems like some people are just bad teammates to everybody, if you know what I mean. 2022 outscored again by Vettel, 37 to 18, a bigger gap that season, and that was Vettel's last season with Aston Martin. Moving on to 2023, though, Aston Martin actually came out the gate with a good fucking car, and this is when shit got out of hand, because Alonso came through, slapped it down on the table. Stroll didn't know what to do, spilled his milk all over the place, and Alonso outscored him 206 to 74, placing fourth ahead of Stroll in 10th. So just got shafted again. 2024 now, he's doing the same shit, scoring only 24 points so far compared to Alonso's 62. And the main thing we have to consider for all of these examples is what is the difference that these massive gaps are making in the Drivers' Championship or the Constructors' Championship as well. For example, like in 2023 when Perez comes second, 200 points behind Max, it doesn't really matter because I think Max could have won the Constructors' Championship by himself that year. So that doesn't really matter. But something like this where it's, 2024, it's 24 points to 62. That's making a big difference in the midfield of the Drivers' Championship and will end up costing them millions of dollars at the end of the season. Not only an overpaying Stroll because he's just a glorified fucking cart driver, but they're losing so much in development and all this other stuff, just because of nepotism. But anyway, while Stroll statistically isn't the worst example ever, the fact that he is a pay driver and Aston Martin could have placed so much better in 2023 and set them up better for these upcoming seasons, like now that Newey's going to be there. When they actually had their shit together back then, they lost valuable points and ended up finishing fifth in the constructors by 22 points, and that season in 2023 losing millions, obviously, and you know, slowing down their trajectory because they were starting to make big strides. I mean, Alonso was on the podium again. Obviously, Stroll's not, but yeah, that was a terrible example. Obviously, Stroll's piece of shit. But anyway, next example, we're going to go back in time a little bit more. We're going to go back to 2008, Lewis Hamilton's first championship season with McLaren and his teammate Heikki Kovalainen. Um, McLaren missed out on the constructors by 21 points in the season, and if Kovalainen was a bit closer, they probably could have swept the championships. It was the point spread was 98 to 53. It was a 45-point spread, and that was obviously enough for them to not win the constructors. Hamilton outperformed Kovalainen that season, 5-1 in pole positions. 5-1 wins, sorry, 7-1 in pole positions, and only one DNF for Hamilton as opposed to three for Kovalainen. In an F1 article they put out in 2021, Kovalainen said that the difference in this season was Lewis's late and hard braking and the way that he squares off the angles and the turns and stuff. That's known now to be his style, but obviously back then when his first driver's championship, that wasn't known to be his thing. And Hamilton's actually been complaining that the current state of the cars doesn't actually benefit him in that style of driving. He has to adapt because of that. But I just thought it was interesting that back then that was what he noticed to be the difference, and that led to quite a big difference in the point spread in the same car. So moving on to another teammate of Hamilton's, Valtteri Bottas. In 2018, Hamilton won the championship by 88 points ahead of both Ferraris, and Bottas was down in 15th, 161 points behind Hamilton. So, while the general consensus is that Bottas was always a really good teammate to Hamilton, which I'm sure that he was, 161 points is gonna cost you quite a bit. And they did end up winning the drivers' championship because of Hamilton's differential in the points. I mean, he won by almost 100 points over Sebastian Vettel in second, but again, that's kind of similar to a Perez and Verstappen situation. Now, in 2021, obviously Bottas and Hamilton were together as well. Hamilton loses to Verstappen again in that controversial last race in Abu Dhabi, and Bottas finished the season 169.5 points behind, almost identical to the 2018 gap, but a little bit more meaningful now because a little more help from Bottas, and that really could have secured the championship. Maybe not necessarily help in the points, but just help in general. We said that for Perez as well, but that was obviously, it turned out in hindsight to be a crucial season, and every little point could matter. Every second of track time could have mattered in that season. So that's going to be the last example. Let me know if you guys think I missed any here. What's your favorite one on the list? And like the video if you like the video. Subscribe. I'll be back with more F1 content over this break. Peace.